Whoa. Volume down. Hello, my holy sisters and brothers. How are you? It's great to be with you on a Thursday night. It's actually the 10th of Teves. That's a dark remembrance in the history of the Jewish people. And we have a fast on the 10th of Teves, but that doesn't start until tomorrow morning. Whoops, I'm sorry. I don't have the do not disturb. There we go. That doesn't start until tomorrow morning. So if you're Jewish, so we have a fast. It's from sunrise to sunset tomorrow, Friday. That's the 10th of Teves. And that's when we recall the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem. That's the end of the first temple. The siege began when Nebuchadnezzar sent his army, and it reached Jerusalem. The siege began on the 10th of Teves. So that's one of the minor fasts. And it's really one of the easiest fasts, probably the easiest fast, because it's a daytime fast and it hits us in the winter. In South America, much tougher fast because they're in summer, many more daylight hours during which they have to fast. How are you, everybody? Let's light up the darkness. And by the way, to our friends who celebrate Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas. I think it's Christmas Eve, right? Tomorrow's show is Friday. It'll be at the regular time, as always on Friday, noon Pacific. Okay, let's see. So who's with us as we're getting it going on a Thursday evening, raining here in LA? Pretty rare, and we are grateful for the rain. Yehudit says, Erev Tov from Florence, South Carolina, wishing you an easy fast for those who are fasting during the day tomorrow. Gail with us from Virginia. James says shalom from Indianapolis. Melissa from Great Neck, New York. Sharon Lila Tov from Lebanon, New Jersey. Colleen from St. Louis, Missouri. Joanne Niddelnacht from Somerset, Texas. Tragically, there were times in history when our friends who were celebrating Christmas took that as an opportunity to wreak violence on the Jews. And thank God, at least for the most part, we certainly don't live in such a time now in the United States. And please God, all Jews should be safe everywhere in the world. But there was a tradition that on this night, the Jews would lay low. They would really lay low. And that is what Joanne is mentioning, Niddelnacht. You can look that up on Google. Steven says shalom from Dover, New Hampshire. Arnold from Northridge, California. Paul from Kansas. Randy from Florida. Rochelle from Discovery Bay. Rebecca from Blaine, Washington. Nancy in North Carolina. Fed is with us from Paris. I'm assuming Paris, France. Bienvenue, Fed. Harold Black says, good Shabbos. Oops, we lit the Shabbos candles a day early. It's great to say good Shabbos. We can start saying good Shabbos even on Wednesday. Some people say good Shabbos all week long. Linda with us from Florida. Janice from Dallas. Mark Keaton says, God bless you all. Peter says hello from Fairfax, Virginia. And Fed says it's raining over there in Paris as well. Over there on the YouTube side, Lynn is in North Texas and Sheila with us from Montana. Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you here. Tonight's episode of AT Daily is dedicated by Matthew Mishori. In memory of Tzvi Mishori. May his neshama, may his soul have a great aliyah. His memory always be for a blessing. And it's a beautiful thing, Matthew, that you're dedicating our learning tonight in the merit of Tzvi. May it push him along in his journey in the world of souls. And we say amen. Also dedicated by Mitch Blumenthal from Florida in honor of my pal Sal. It was great to reconnect with Mitch after many years. We went to, did we go to elementary school? Definitely went to synagogue together from third grade on, where I grew up in New City, New York. And Mitch, reconnected as adults, and he loves what we do here at Accidental Talmudist, and we honor you. You and Colleen and your beautiful family should have tremendous brachas in your life, unlimited blessings, and we say amen. All right. Here we go. For those of you who might have missed it earlier today, highly recommended. We had Professor Alan Dershowitz on Accidental Talmudist Live. Specifically, we were discussing the differences between Talmudic law and American law in capital cases. It was a fascinating discussion. No one more expert than Professor Dershowitz talking about the modern law of capital cases and whether to apply the death penalty or not. And also, he's very erudite in the Talmud. He went to yeshiva in Brooklyn. We've touched on a lot of other topics as well. Some people were concerned that this was going to be a politics discussion. It really wasn't. Politics is something we stay away from here at Accidental Talmudist. But it was really interesting, and we broke open a Mishna that from page 37a, I think, in the Talmud and Tractate Sanhedrin, which is where it talks about how the judges intimidate the witnesses, right? Witness intimidation, that sounds like something we would never do. But in a capital case, the judges in a beis din, in a rabbinic court, intimidate the witnesses, meaning you should know that this is a capital case. If the defendant is found guilty, the death penalty will be imposed. And you better be sure that you are telling the truth, because if this is a wrongful conviction, there is no making up for it. There's no way to undo the damage of a wrongful conviction. In a capital case, the defendant would have been executed. Unlike a monetary damages case where, okay, there was a mistake, a wrongful decree, they could just reverse the damages. And it's pursuant to that text and charging the witnesses in a capital case that the Talmud says, and you should know that, the damage would be permanent, because you would kill not only the defendant, right? Not only would the defendant be wrongfully executed, but all his potential descendants would be as well. And that we learn from the story of Cain and Abel in the book of Genesis, where God says, after Cain kills Abel, and he says, where is your brother? And he says, am I my brother's keeper? And God says, the bloods of your brother cry out to me from the ground. Not the blood, but the bloods, plural. And our sages understood that to mean that not only the blood of the one who was killed, the innocent who was killed, Abel, but all of those potential descendants who could have come from him. And we learn that just as Adam, the one man who was the father of all people, from him a whole world worth of people came, from any person, so many people can spring, all those future descendants. And that is why whoever takes a life in Israel, it is as if he has destroyed a whole world. And whoever saves a life in Israel, it is as if he has saved a whole world. That quote is very famous, and we often hear it, but most people don't realize that it comes from the court procedure in a capital case, in a case of murder, of homicide case, before a rabbinic court, when the witnesses are being charged, that they have to take their testimony with the utmost seriousness, because a life is on the line. At any rate, it was a fascinating discussion with Professor Dershowitz. It's there on our page. Highly recommend you check it out. All right. So what are we talking about here? First of all, we're holding on Daf Lamed Gimel, page 33 in Tractate Pesachim, the fourth tractate of the Talmud. We're in chapter 2, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 5. Our Mishnah said something that was a little bit curious, which is that if one unwittingly eats chametz of teruma during Passover, meaning, so chametz is what you can't eat during Passover. Bread, leavened bread, any kind of leavened products are prohibited during Passover. Some of those chametz products, those leavened products, may have been set aside before Passover as teruma. They may have been consecrated for to fulfill a Jew's obligation to tithe for the upkeep of the priests. So we set aside some of our grain, some of our olive oil. I mean, this is an agrarian society. The first 2% of our produce for the priests. And once it's set aside for the priests, only the priest can eat it. A non-priest may not eat it. If a non-priest does eat of the teruma that's set aside for the priest, then he has to repay what he ate, plus pay a penalty of 20% of the value of what he ate. Now, the reason why this is curious, so the Mishna, our Mishna says that if one eats chametz of teruma during Passover, and he does so unwittingly, so then he has to repay what he ate and add the penalty. That's if he did it unwittingly. If he did it intentionally, if he ate this chametz intentionally, and it turns out to be teruma, he is exempt from paying the priest for what he ate, and is exempt from the penalty as well. Why? Because we have this principle that when one action results in liability to two crimes and two penalties, only the bigger, harsher, more stringent penalty is applied, not both penalties. And in this case, one who intentionally eats chametz, whether teruma or not, any chametz on Passover is subject to charis, excision, death at the hands of the heavenly court, meaning that your life is shortened by heaven, by a decree from heaven. Since he's suffering that fate, and the Torah says one who intentionally eats chametz during Passover that soul shall be cut off from its people, meaning charis. Therefore, we don't also impose the repayment and the penalty for eating the teruma during Passover. Now, this is curious to us because chametz during Passover has no value. So even though it was teruma, it was consecrated before Passover that only the priest could eat it, the fact that it has no value during Passover, and as we discussed yesterday, what does one repay? Does he repay the amount of food that one ate or the monetary value of the food that one ate? And the answer was the monetary value of the food that one ate. But the monetary value of chametz among the Jewish people during Passover is zero, because no one can eat it, no one can possess it, no one can benefit from it, at least according to the majority opinion. So what did he eat? The thing that he ate had no value. It might have been consecrated as teruma before Passover began, but now it has no value. And indeed, the law eventually comes out that he does not have to repay the value to the priest because there is no value. And for the same reason, he doesn't have to pay a penalty of 20% because 20% of zero remains zero. We also learned that the minimum amount for you to be considered liable for this, for any type of teruma eating, a non-priest eating the food consecrated for a priest, is an olive bulk. If you eat less than that, you still have to repay what you ate, but there's no penalty because you didn't really eat anything. For something to be considered eating, there's a minimum amount of that. And what is that minimum amount? The volume of an olive. So there's this curiosity so why did the Mishna say that if you eat teruma of chametz during Passover unwittingly, so then you do have to repay. You do have to repay and add the penalty, right? So why if it has no value? Now, one approach to the answer of what's in the Mishnah, even though it didn't become the halacha, the law, is that when we're talking about consecrated items, and whether you consecrate something to bring it as an offering on the altar in the holy temple, or you consecrate it as something set aside for the priests, teruma, it acquires a measure of holiness. And when we're talking about things that are consecrated and which acquire holiness, the laws with respect to those things are going to be very stringent indeed. And why? Because something that's consecrated, whether it's for the priests or for the altar, right, it becomes kodesh, holy. And in the Hebrew root, kodesh means set apart, right? Not for us. If we're not priests, if we're not the altar, if we're not God, it is not for us. Holiness really means separated, right? Separated from the mundane, set apart for the purpose of holiness. So these laws have a much greater stringency. Mar, the son of Rabbana, said, with respect to other mitzvahs, with respect to other commandments that one may come to violate and be liable to bring some kind of an offering, intent matters. Right? It's good that we were talking about with a criminal lawyer today on this show. Intent is certainly one of the elements of a crime. Right? If somebody ends up committing an action, but there was no intent to do anything criminal, it truly was an accident. I mean, that's going to be a different action than if he committed the same action with intent to commit the crime. And this is certainly true with respect to other obligations in the Torah. So the example that Mar, the son of Rabbana, brings is a person who on Shabbos meant to cut, let's say, some celery stalks, right? He meant to cut some celery in order to put it in a salad. Now, that's permissible on Shabbos. You can't cook on Shabbos, but to cut up some celery and then put it on your plate and eat it, that is definitely permitted on Shabbos. However, if the celery is still growing in the ground, then you are not permitted to cut that celery in order to take pieces and put it in your salad. Why? Because if you cut a plant that's still growing in the ground on Shabbos, you have now committed the transgression of harvesting, right? That is absolutely a prohibited labor on Shabbos, and you would become liable to bring a sin offering for the unwitting transgression, right? But unwitting would mean that you, that you didn't know it was Shabbos, right? You harvested on purpose. You didn't know it was Shabbos. So in that case, you bring the sin offering and you're liable. But if you saw a piece of celery lying on the ground and you meant to cut it because you thought it was detached from the ground, so that the action that you thought you were doing was cutting produce, which is already detached, that's a different kind of non-intent than not knowing it was Shabbos and doing the action which is prohibited on Shabbos. Now you thought you were doing a different action, right? If you did the action you thought you were doing, you just didn't know it was Shabbos, that's unwitting. If you cut something thinking what had already been removed from the ground, but actually it was still in the ground and you cut it, that's a different category. And in that situation, a person is exempt from bringing a sin offering. He does not become liable to bring the sin offering because he did not have intent to cut something that was growing in the ground. He thought it was already out of the ground. For some reason, maybe that he had some celery lying on the ground and it was lying near celery that was still growing in the ground, and he cut the wrong stalk. So that truly had no intent related to it. However, if we're talking about items that have been consecrated, right, either for an offering in the temple or for the use of the priest, then this standard of whether you have intent or not becomes different. So the example that Mar, the son of Rabbana, gives here is one of the kinds of offerings that were brought in the temple. Is called the burnt offering. And when you bring a burnt offering, that's actually different than the elevation offering. One of the things that's left over from that is the shearings, right? So if you're bringing a sheep, that sheep gets sheared, I guess, before it goes up on the altar. And I guess these shearings are probably one of the gifts for the priests in the temple. So if there's two piles of shearings, and one came from a non-sacred animal, and the other came from a sacred animal, meaning a consecrated animal that was set aside to be offered in the temple. And so he wanted to take some of these shearings, to like stuff into his coat to keep him warm in the winter. And he meant to reach into the box of the shearings that came from a non-sacred animal. And by mistake, he reached into the box with the shearings from a sacred animal, from a consecrated animal. So now what he takes out of the box of shearings that came from a consecrated animal, those shearings don't belong to a non-priest. They belong, well, in this case, it's not even to the priest, it belongs to the temple, right? So when you take something that belongs to the temple, now you have transgressed the prohibition on misusing property that belongs to the temple. And you do have to go through the process of repaying and offering the penalty, the 20% penalty for misusing the property of the temple. And it doesn't matter that you intended to reach into a different box, just like the person who cut celery on Shabbos, that he thought it was already detached and was doing a permitted action, but it turned out that it was still growing in the ground. There, he doesn't become liable to bring a sin offering, but here where you reach into the wrong box and take the shearings of a consecrated animal, you do become liable to the procedure and the penalty for that. Okay, so what Mar is saying is that the standards with regard to intent of consecrated property, which would include teruma, they're much higher, right? They're much higher. The intent, we don't care whether it's intent or not. It's more of a strict liability offense, and perhaps that's why our Mishna said that even though the teruma of chametz on Passover is worthless, has no monetary value, that the person might have to pay for what he used and add the penalty as well. But as I said before, the law didn't come out that way. This was a good argument, but it did not win among the sages. And the law is that actually if you eat teruma of chametz during Passover, there is no repayment or penalty. Okay. Now, with regard to what if a person tried to designate teruma during Passover, right? So for whatever reason, now this is something like how would this even happen, right? A Jew cannot possess chametz during Passover. So how is it possible that he would separate teruma from his chametz on Passover? It shouldn't be possible, and it certainly is not permitted. And a reason that we know it's not permitted, it's not actually that because, well, you're not allowed to possess it, so how could you come to designate it? Because maybe he did possess it, and he was already violating a law, but okay, he's got it. He's got that chametz there. He's got that grain, those leavened products. And he actually, even though he's violating the prohibition on owning chametz during Passover, he still wants to separate some of it out as teruma. Maybe he didn't know it was Passover, for example, and that's why he possessed it. So then the question is, so what he separated as teruma, does it actually become teruma? And the answer is going to be no, because you cannot take teruma from something that has no value. How do we know that? The Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived that a worthless item cannot be designated as teruma? Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said that the verse states, the first fruits of your grain, this is Deuteronomy 18:4, the first fruits of your grain, your wine, your oil, and the first of the fleece of your sheep shall you give to him, meaning the priest. To him and not to his fire, says Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. In other words, what you're giving to him is something that is of use to him. If you give him teruma of chametz during Passover, the only thing that can be done with that chametz is burning it. You have to burn it, right? And we're not even supposed to benefit from the burning. So we're supposed to when we give teruma to a priest, we need to give him something of value, not something that's just going to go right into his fire, where he can't even benefit from the warmth or the light of that fire. He simply needs to burn it. You're not really doing him a favor when you're giving him something that he's required to burn as soon as he receives it. One must give the priest something that he can use for any purpose, and not something that the priest will be forced to burn. Now, even if you say that he's forced to burn it as fuel, now when would that happen? So that's not chametz during Passover, but if you give a priest impure teruma, right? If you set aside teruma for the priest, but it's in a state of tuma, of ritual impurity, perhaps because before you touched it, you came into contact with a human corpse and then you touched the teruma, you rendered it tamei, ritually impure. Now, if you give it to the priest, he can't eat it. He would be able to burn it and actually benefit from the burning, meaning he could use it as fuel for his wood fire, or he could use it as light in his lamp, but he couldn't eat it, right? And so here we're learning that not only is it prohibited for chametz during Passover, but it's prohibited to give a priest impure teruma, tamei teruma. Why? Because you're commanded to give it to him and not to his fire. And then, hold on a second. And Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, raised an objection to this teaching. He said, well, wait a minute. What about that which was taught in a Mishna? That one may not separate teruma from ritually impure produce for ritually pure produce, but if one unwittingly separated in this manner, then his teruma is valid teruma. So the sages have said, okay, well, you can't separate teruma from something that's tamei, that's ritually impure, which the priest is not going to be able to eat. It's prohibited. But if you did do it, then it is teruma. The designation still stands. So in that case, so you shouldn't have done it, right? A priori, you shouldn't have done it. But once you did it, because what you did is you separated for the priest. In other words, you consecrated it. And we're going to be very slow to deconsecrate something that's been consecrated, even if it was consecrated improperly. So perhaps this chametz during Passover, you shouldn't have, maybe because the guy didn't know it was Passover, he shouldn't have, and he certainly shouldn't have separated it as teruma for the priest. But now that he did separate it as teruma for the priest, maybe it becomes teruma, right? Now here there's a difference, right? Because the tamei teruma has some monetary value because it can be burned as fuel or for light. Whereas the chametz during Passover has no monetary value at all because it can't be used even for that kind of minimal benefit, right? So that would be a difference in that case. And the law is one may not separate teruma from ritually impure produce for ritually pure produce. One may not separate teruma for ritually impure produce for ritually pure produce. However, if one did this unwittingly, then the produce he separated becomes teruma. So that is the law, but nevertheless, we can't apply that principle to chametz during Passover because there is a difference in value, and the chametz has no value. Tonight's going to be a short class. So if you have questions on what I've already taught, or even if you have questions from the conversation we had with Professor Dershowitz earlier, feel free to ask and put it in the comments. Now we're going to just skip a little because the material in the middle of today's daf, I found it confusing and I don't feel competent to teach it well today. And today was a tough day. I was a little bit short on time. So we're going to skip toward the end of today's daf. And here we're going to get into a related topic about a stumbling block. And this very much reflects rabbinic thinking, right? So the Torah says you shall not place a stumbling block before the blind. So you don't want to put something in a person's path that is going to lead them to transgress a prohibition of the Torah. Rava said, so there is a rabbinic decree prohibiting these things that we're about to discuss, lest the person encounter a stumbling block. So, if one keeps tamei fruit of teruma, right? So a person is he's got an orchard and he harvests fruit. Okay, now the beginning of the first 2% of his fruit harvest is going to go to the priest. It's going to be set aside as teruma. The farmer can choose which priest he gives it to. That's called the benefit of discretion. But he must set aside the first 2% of his crop to the priest. Now, some of this fruit, let's say it became tamei. There was some event, somebody came by and touched this fruit that had already been harvested, and now some of it or all of it or some amount of it is tamei, is ritually impure. Okay? Now, let's say, so he has some of this impure fruit of teruma. Okay. So what happened here is it was already separated as teruma. I beg your pardon. It was already separated as teruma. And either he's keeping it as teruma, but he hasn't had the chance to give it to the priest yet, or he's going to give it, or he already gave it to the priest and the priest has it. But the point is that we have teruma. It was separated to be teruma first, and then it became tamei. So then what do we do with it, right? The priest can't eat it. That's the key. The priest can't eat it. But what we have is a discussion here where it is possible that even though a fruit is tamei, the juice inside of it, according to some opinions, when you squeeze it, the juice is pure, right? Because the juice, even though the fruit is ritually impure, is tamei, the juice that comes out of it might be pure. Some say no, it's not. If it comes from impure fruit, it's going to be impure juice. But others say that the fruit itself is sort of like a vessel that became impure on the outside, and the juice which was contained inside the fruit remains pure. So if you're following that opinion, it's not a universal opinion, that's for sure. But if you're following that opinion that the juice is pure even though the fruit is impure, so this fruit that became impure, okay, I'm not going to eat it. Let's say you're a priest, right? Only the priest could eat it to begin with. So he can't eat it, but he could squeeze it and drink the juice. It's teruma, it's set aside for the priest. He can't eat it because it's impure, but maybe he could drink the juice because when the juice is pressed out of this impure fruit, at least according to some opinions, the juice itself is pure. So we have a rabbinic decree which says, well, this impure fruit that you're planning to squeeze its juice because the juice is going to be pure, you can't keep this kind of fruit lying around, right? Because it's going to become a stumbling block. Why? Because, okay, you have a nice plan that you're only going to use it for squeezing and drinking the juice that comes out. But while it's lying around, being stored around your property, Mr. Priest, you might come to eat it, right? So you might come to eat it. Teruma is set aside for you, but if it's impure, you're not permitted to eat it. So don't keep something around that if you went through a procedure might become permitted, but until you went through that procedure, squeezing the juice, it is prohibited for you, and you might forget and come to eat that fruit. Likewise, well, that's it. And so how does he say it? Lest he encounter a stumbling block. If one keeps ritually impure fruit of teruma in order to press it for its juice, it is possible that he will forget its status and accidentally eat it. Abaye said to him, are we really concerned about this type of stumbling block? Wasn't it taught in a baraisa? One may light a fire with bread and oil of teruma that became tamei. All right, so now we're talking about, a moment ago we were talking about fruit that became tamei, and it's possible that its juice will be tahor, ritually pure, once it's squeezed out. Now Abaye says, but wait a minute, we've already learned that with respect to bread or oil that was set aside as teruma for the priest, and it became tamei, it became ritually impure, so the priest can't eat that oil or eat that bread. One may but the baraisa said one may light a fire with bread or oil that are impure. We've seen that a few times now, right? So whether it's bread or olive oil, if it became tamei, the priest can't eat it, but he can light his fire with it, or he can light his lamp with it. And it can be deduced from this baraisa, says Abaye, that there is no concern that a person will forget and eat these foods. Rava answered him, bread is only permitted when one throws it among the wood used for fuel, so that it is ruined and no longer considered edible. And teruma oil is permitted only when one puts it into a repulsive vessel, so that one will not come to drink it. So the sages are very aware that human nature, particularly when it comes to just, putting into our mouths that which we want, we will conveniently forget whatever we're not supposed to do. I mean, how many of us have said, I know I shouldn't be overeating, I'm going to go on a diet, I'm not going to overeat, and then an hour later, we're eating that which we vowed not to eat. We put things in our mouths. So Rav is saying we should not keep things around. A priest should not keep around this teruma that became tamei because he might eat it. Abaye said, yeah, but he is allowed to light his fire with it, right? Whether it's bread that became tamei or oil for his lamp, he can use those things. So clearly, he doesn't have to dispose of it just because it became tamei. He can burn it. But Rava answers back, yeah, he can burn it. But in terms of keeping this tamei teruma around his house, he's only allowed to do that if he clearly designates it in such a way that no one will come to eat it by mistake. Meaning that bread that he's going to use in his fire, okay, throw it in the wood pile. Don't store it in the bread box or in the refrigerator or anywhere in the house where somebody might consider it food that could be eaten. Once it's thrown outside and in the wood pile, okay, well, no one's going to go eat the bread that's lying on the wood pile. Or likewise, oil that you can't eat it as olive oil in your salad anymore. You're going to use it to burn. You need to store that in a vessel which is repulsive, meaning it's clearly for burning in lamps and not for eating. And it's not just that it's clearly marked, but that it renders what's inside of it repulsive for the purpose of eating. With regard to the matter itself, it was taught, one may light with bread and oil of teruma that became tamei, ritually impure. The sages limited the application of this law. Excuse me. They limited the application of this law. As Abaye said in the name of Chizkiah, and Rav said in the name of the sages of the school of Rabbi Yitzchak bar Marta, that Rav Huna said, they taught that one may use impure teruma as firewood only with regard to bread. However, with regard to wheat, no, one may not light a fire with it, lest one encounter a stumbling block and eat it, because wheat will not become inedible by being placed among the firewood. Right? So bread that was set aside as teruma became tamei, so it was given to the priest, but he can't eat it because it's ritually impure. So okay, he follows this law, he tosses it in the wood pile. He's just going to use this impure bread for fuel in his oven fire. Excuse me. But with respect to wheat, just harvested wheat, that's different. It became tamei, so he's not going to be able to eat it, cook with it, etc. So you might think he can toss it on his wood pile, but wheat is not going to be rendered repulsive and inedible just because it's stacked outside near his wood pile. Somebody might come along and, I guess take some of that wheat, take a pile of it. It's just going to be sitting outside, but it's not going to be rendered repulsive. And I don't know, just eat it raw or put it into some kind of other food and bake with it or use it. It's not going to be ruined in the same way that bread would be ruined when it's tossed on the wood pile. And therefore, wheat in that situation would be considered a stumbling block that could lead someone to transgress. And Rabbi Yochanan said, even wheat may be used as fuel. And the Gemara asks, and why does he permit this? Let us be concerned lest he encounter a stumbling block. And the Gemara answers on what Rav Ashi said with regard to a different issue. This is referring to boiled and repulsive wheat, i.e. wheat that one boiled and then placed in a repulsive area, in which case he need not be concerned that this wheat will accidentally be eaten. So too here, Rabbi Yochanan must be referring to wheat that was boiled and became repulsive. I think our takeaway is just simple. Don't trust yourself to just say, I'm going to do that or I'm not going to do that. And it's something that is difficult to do. It's something that you're going to be tempted to do. So just saying out of willpower, I'm going to stop doing it, it's not realistic. It's not realistic. So if you're going to curb your eating habits, if you're going to modify your behavior in some way, modifying one's behavior is one of the most difficult things to do. And you have to put safeguards in place that are going to prevent you from just, doing what you want to do, letting your yetzer hara, your evil inclination, just take over and, seize what it wants, irrespective of what the higher thinking capacities would like us to do. But, when confronted with the animal desires of the body, the higher thinking capacities of our brain often lose. And it's a good lesson here in what the Torah taught, lest it be a stumbling block, right? When we keep things around the house that are definitely going to tempt us, we're putting a stumbling block in front of ourselves, right? We become the blind, and that is the stumbling block. All right, let's go to questions and comments. Hold on, here we go. Charles Abraham Ramirez Verdugo. It is interesting how the fruit that is impure could produce pure juice. Is this similar to the concept of the klipot, or the godliness being hidden or rising or raising the sparks of holiness? I mean, you're making a very beautiful spiritual connection here. I don't know. It really should have a kind of spiritual value, a spiritual charge in what they're saying here. But somehow it seems like they're saying it's counterintuitive. I mean, apple juice, the juice that comes out of an apple, is pretty intimately related to the apple. But when we're talking about teruma, spiritual impurity, I mean, that's why your question is so good. This definitely is a spiritual matter. And we can see that just as, for example, if a sandal becomes tamei, right, but then you replace all of its straps and the sole, and then at a certain point you have a new sandal, because you replaced everything, right? You did it one at a time, but now it's a whole new product. And then one could ask, the old sandal had teruma, it was spiritually impure, but this is a whole new sandal. It's like we've destroyed the old sandal and created a new sandal. And likewise, when you take the juice out of the fruit, it's like it's a new product, right? And so at least according to some opinions, the new juice is a new entity. It's not the same entity as the fruit that it came from, and the fruit that it came from is considered like a vessel, like a receptacle. And certain vessels, they could become tamei on the outside, but not on the inside. So I like the link that you're making. Charles is discussing this idea. It's a very Kabbalistic idea that when God created the world, right, it was like there was an event where God's holiness, like when he sort of imbued this new physical world with the spiritual energy of God's essence, it was like that energy was too powerful for a physical universe to contain, and like the world just shattered, right? And so what does that mean, practically speaking? It's that throughout this physical world where everything seems to be mundane, there's actually sparks of holiness that are trapped in the mundane world. So, for example, you take a dollar bill, right? That is a mundane object. And in fact, a lot of impurity and sin can attach to money if it's used for sinful purposes. But when you take that dollar and commit charity with it, right, and give it to the needy and give it to a person so that they can eat, so now you've done holy work with that dollar, and it's like you're releasing some of those sparks of holiness that were potentially there and waiting for a human who's spiritually minded and wants to serve the Creator by taking care of the creatures. You release that spark, right? An animal can't. Only humans have that capacity to put their own needs aside and to do for another for the purpose of serving God by taking care of the creatures. And then we do release those sparks of holiness. So maybe it's a nice tie, nice way to think of those things. Lynn says, these pages lately have been really tough. The AT Daily Show keeps me reading. How dare I complain when I don't even have to teach it? You set a great example for us, a high bar indeed. Thanks. Thank you, Lynn. Sometimes I got to say, I just feel like I fall short. I read the page, and I really try to understand it, and then I read it again. So I take my notes and prepare here in my notebook so that I can teach it. And sometimes it's like the ichor, the essence of the teaching really comes through for me, and I feel like, I got it, and I can communicate it, and we have a really good class. And like I said, some days are really tough, and I feel like I'm falling short tonight. I feel like I didn't really get what this page is offering, and that I could communicate properly. But, when you got to teach and you got to learn every day for 7.5 years, not every day is going to be a bell ringer, right? So we just do our best and keep going. Lucy says it was a great AT interview with Alan Dershowitz, so sharp, and great connections with the Talmud as well. Definitely recommend you check that show out today. We went to a lot of areas and really comparing, like, what were the rabbis after and what is American jurisprudence after, when a life is on the line. When, a victim's life was taken, now we have a defendant. Should the death penalty be applied? It's really, really a rich discussion. And I'm not sure exactly how old Professor Dershowitz is. I mean, he taught at Harvard Law School for 50 years and he's retired. So he's got to be close to 80 or maybe 80. And I pray that I could be as sharp at that age as he is. An amazing, amazing and gifted attorney, writer, and speaker. And I love when he applies the power of his mind to advocate for the state of Israel, which is so often slandered and tarred with falsehood. And we talked about that as well. Yehudit says, excellent interview with the professor. Thank you, Nina and Sal. Everyone should listen to the replay. I will listen again, even though I listened to it live. So there you have it. That's from Yehudit Sobel. All right, my friends, that's what I've got for us this evening. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Friday, noon Pacific. I'll be fasting, and so will the people who observe the fast, the 10th of Tevet. When the siege of Jerusalem began, of the first temple, when Nebuchadnezzar's army attacked Jerusalem, and we commemorate that dark event in our history with the fast of Tevet. This year coincides with Christmas. It's just a coincidence and usually does not come out that way. But for our friends who celebrate Christmas, we wish you absolutely a Merry Christmas. You should have the merriest and most joy-filled holiday possible in these dark times, and may you be able to connect with your family members, if not in person, then with the digital airwaves, as it were. So many of us are relying on those digital connections in this time, but thank God we have these tools. It would be far worse if this pandemic was happening at a time that we couldn't relate with each other like this as we are right now. Sending you all lots of light and a big hug. All the best.